It all started on a night when curiosity led us into a place we shouldn't have been. There are nights that pass quietly, and then there are nights that crawl into your skin, that twist your mind, and change everything you thought you knew. This is the story of my night in the graveyard. If you're watching this, hear me now. Take my warning, not for my sake, but for yours. Because what I'm about to tell you, the darkness that followed us, it doesn't stay in one place, it follows. I know where you live. Linda nodded. Straps it. Hugo said, you think you're safe out in the open, with the stars above and the wind in your hair, but you're not. I wasn't, and after you hear what happened that night, you'll never look at a quiet, empty graveyard the same way again. The silent graveyard. The car's headlights flickered for a moment before casting an eerie glow over the fog-shrouded path ahead. Dylan, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, glanced at Grace. She sat quietly beside him, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the dashboard. I told you we shouldn't have come here, Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Relax, Dylan replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. It's just a cemetery. It's the perfect place for a little adventure. Besides, we'll be fine. We just need to grab some shots for the vlog, and then we'll leave. But the caretaker, something feels off about him, Grace protested, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if expecting someone to appear. Dylan laughed nervously. You're overthinking it. He's probably just a little eccentric, that's all. The car pulled to a stop in front of the iron gates that loomed like sentinels over the forgotten graveyard. The trees around them groaned in the wind, their branches creaking like the bones of some ancient creature. The air felt cold, colder than it should have been for late autumn. Dylan turned off the engine and the silence of the graveyard descended upon them, a silence that seemed too deep, too suffocating. You sure you want to go through with this? Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. Absolutely, Dylan said, forcing a grin. This is going to be amazing. We'll get the footage, make a name for ourselves, and then get out. The cemetery looked abandoned, overgrown with ivy and weeds, the tombstones leaning at odd angles like crooked teeth. It had a decayed beauty to it, like a place that time had forgotten. Dylan grabbed his camera and unbuckled his seatbelt. We'll stick together, he said, trying to reassure her. No ghost stories, no creepy old man, just us. Grace hesitated, but finally nodded. They both stepped out into the cold night air, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. As they walked past the gates, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery was watching them. He turned the camera on and began recording, the red light flickering ominously. This is Dylan and Grace, he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet. We're here at the Old Hollow Cemetery. It's said to be one of the most haunted places in the state, so let's see what we can find. They ventured deeper into the graveyard, the old tombstones surrounding them like silent sentinels. The wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that made the hair on the back of Dylan's neck stand up. It was the soft, almost imperceptible sounds, like whispers just beyond his hearing. Did you hear that? Grace's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. Dylan stopped and listened. The wind howled through the trees, but something else was there too, a low murmur, almost like voices, coming from nowhere. He felt a chill run down his spine. It's just the wind, he said, forcing his voice to sound steady. But Grace wasn't convinced. Dylan, this place feels wrong. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and Dylan's camera flickered on its own. The lens zoomed in on a distant figure standing near an old mausoleum. A tall, thin man, his face obscured by shadows. Who's that? Grace asked, her voice shaking. Dylan turned the camera toward the figure, but the moment the lens focused, the man was gone. There was only the empty space between the gravestones, untouched. Still, nothing there, Dylan said, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. He laughed lightly, but it was strained. "It's just the shadows playing tricks." But Grace was already backing away. "I don't like this, Dylan. Let's go." Before he could respond, a sudden gust of wind blew through the cemetery, sending a chill so deep into his bones that he couldn't stop himself from shivering. The fog thickened, rolling in like a flood. It swallowed the mausoleum, the trees, and the gravestones around them, until it felt like they were trapped in some kind of ghostly prison. "Look at this," Dylan said, turning the camera toward the gravestone nearest to them. It was cracked, the letters worn away by time. But something was written there in fresh red paint. The words were distorted, as though scratched into the stone by a desperate hand. "Leave now or stay forever." Grace gasped, her face pale. That wasn't there before. Dylan stepped closer to read the inscription, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, touching the cold stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a low groan sounded from the earth beneath them. It was a deep, guttural sound, as if the graveyard itself were waking up, stretching its limbs. "Dylan, let's go, please," Grace begged, her voice trembling with fear. But Dylan didn't hear her. His eyes were locked on the grave, on the words that seemed to writhe in the dim light. His body froze, and the camera's red light blinked out. Everything went dark. Then they heard it. A soft shuffle of feet. Slow. Deliberate. The sound of something moving closer. Closer. "Who's there?" Dylan called out, his voice thick with panic. His heart raced in his chest as he swung the camera around in a frantic circle, but no one answered. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped his shoulder from behind. He whipped around, but no one was there. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed up into Grace. "What was that?" Grace whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know, Before Dylan could finish, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Closer. Then, without warning, a low, guttural voice whispered from the darkness. "So, leave now." Dylan spun around, but the figure from before was standing there again, his face still obscured in shadow. The man's eyes glowed faintly, but there was no warmth in them. Only an unsettling, hollow emptiness. Grace screamed, pulling Dylan by the arm. "Run!" But the ground seemed to shift under their feet, the path they had come from now swallowed by thick, impenetrable fog. The gates that had been open when they entered were now nowhere to be seen. They were trapped. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them from all directions. They weren't alone anymore. Something was closing in on them. Then, just as Dylan turned to flee, the cemetery's ancient gates slammed shut with a deafening crash. The two of them stood there, wide-eyed, caught in a nightmare with no escape. The sound of a low, mocking laugh echoed through the mist, followed by another whisper. "You stayed forever." The unforgiving end. The silence that followed the closing of the gates felt oppressive, as if the world itself had held its breath. Dylan's chest tightened, his heart hammering in his ears. His mind raced, struggling to understand what was happening. How had they gotten trapped? The fog was thick, choking the life from the air, and there was no sign of the way out. Grace grabbed his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "What do we do now, Dylan?" she asked, her voice small and desperate. He could barely look at her, his eyes scanning the graveyard, the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. It was as though the cemetery had come alive, every crack in the earth, every broken tombstone whispering his name, pulling him in deeper. The whispers were louder now, relentless, scratching at his sanity. "You're not leaving." The voice echoed from all directions, a chorus of cold, empty whispers. But it wasn't just words. There was a palpable malice in the air, a presence, something ancient and angry, Dylan spun around, the camera shaking in his hands. The figure, that same man, stood just beyond the fog, his eyes glowing brighter now, as if drawing the very darkness toward him. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, only the crackling of the air between them. "Who are you?" Dylan shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, a shadow against the fog, watching them with those hollow eyes. And then, slowly, it began to move. The ground trembled beneath them. "Dylan!" Grace screamed, her grip tightening on his arm as she pulled him backwards. "We have to run." But Dylan couldn't move. His legs felt frozen, like the ground had sunk its claws into him. The camera in his hands flickered once more, its red light flashing erratically as if it too was panicking. He tried to focus, tried to make sense of the scene in front of him, but the world was spinning out of control. The cemetery around them shifted and distorted. The tombstones weren't just leaning, they were sinking, disappearing into the earth, as though the ground itself was devouring them. The figure moved closer, each step deliberate, slow, but terrifyingly inevitable. Dylan could feel the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting. He glanced at Grace, her face pale and tear-streaked, eyes wide with terror. She was breathing heavily, her breaths visible in the freezing air. "Please," Grace whimpered, looking back at the figure. I can't do this." And then the earth beneath them cracked open. A deep, horrifying rift appeared, splitting the ground apart. It was as though the very land was being torn open to reveal what lay beneath. A yawning abyss of blackness, far deeper than any grave, far colder than the night air. A distant, hollow voice echoed from the depths of the rift. A voice that didn't seem to come from anywhere, but everywhere at once. "You are mine now." The figure was there again, its outline shifting in and out of focus. Its eyes gleamed with a predatory light, glowing with a sickly yellow hue. And then, the ground gave way. Grace screamed as the earth crumbled beneath her feet. Dylan lunged forward, grabbing her wrists just in time, but the pull from the rift was too strong. The earth itself seemed to be pulling them into the darkness below. "Dylan!" Grace cried, her voice filled with panic. With every ounce of strength, Dylan yanked her back, but it was no use. The rift opened wider, a bottomless pit that seemed to devour everything in its path. The wind howled, the trees creaking as if in agony. The very air felt alive, suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. And then from the shadows came a terrible sound, the screeching of metal, the gnashing of something sharp and unrelenting. The figure emerged from the fog completely now, but it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving, its limbs contorting in unnatural ways, stretching and bending as if it were made of shadows themselves. Its mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, as it emitted a sound so horrible, so guttural, that Dylan's ears rang with it. Grace's scream pierced the air, but it was cut short. A cold hand, thin and skeletal, shot out from the shadows and gripped her throat. Her eyes went wide with terror as the figure pulled her towards the abyss, her feet dragging across the earth. "No!" Dylan screamed, reaching out for her. But the rift yawned wide between them, and the ground beneath him cracked further. He reached, he begged, but she was slipping through his fingers, vanishing into the dark void, swallowed whole by the very earth itself. Her last words, choked and desperate, echoed in his mind. "I love you, Dylan." And then there was only silence. Dylan stumbled back, his chest heaving, his body trembling uncontrollably. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no air left to breathe. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides. The figure, no longer just a shadow, stood before him now, its face twisted in an expression of cruel satisfaction. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The ground shook again, and Dylan fell to his knees. The earth, the tombstones, the cemetery, all of it seemed to be closing in on him. The fog swirled around him like tendrils of something alive, pulling at his skin, at his very soul. And then, as the figure reached down to him, its fingers curling like claws, Dylan understood. He had stayed. And now, he would stay forever. The figure's voice, now a guttural growl, whispered one final command. You belong to me now. Forever. Those words, the ground beneath Dylan's feet gave way entirely, and he fell, falling into the abyss that had claimed Grace, the very abyss that would now claim him. But as he plummeted into the dark, he knew without a doubt that this was not just death. It was a prison, a never-ending torment. For him, for Grace, and for anyone who dared to enter this cursed graveyard.